Okay, so we are going to use Editor++ in this tutorial to turn these three items here into swinging items, like this, into moving items. So these are pretty simple items. They've only got one mesh as part of each of them. If an item has multiple meshes, then it's a bit more complex. But these are pretty straightforward. For this, you should have Editor++ installed. You need 0.80 or greater. So now with these sorts of things, I usually start from a base item, which is this one, just because it has some moving stuff already and it's a simple mesh, so it's easy to replace. You can use any other custom moving item though as a base for something like this. The main things to take into account, or to note in advance, so what we're going to do is we're going to have to copy, which you can just click this item name here. We need to copy this because we're going to use this as a source item. So we're not actually going to edit the item itself, we're going to edit a new item and replace the mesh of this new item with the mesh of this previous item. We'll also, you'll notice here on these two on the right, they're actually different items. Basically the swinging large blade and large blade 2, one of them has a shadow and one does not. I've actually accidentally copied or pasted another one here. So I'll show you how to fix that as well. Usually you don't want shadows for swinging items or things like that because the shadows are static, as you can see, and you can get some weird sort of bugs in there for whatever reason. Okay, so let's get started. Firstly, we're going to want to edit our destination item. So in this case, this is our ZZ Rot Balloons thing, and we'll call it Swinging Hammer Large. Okay, with pivot parameters, we can just delete those. Placement parameters, these will all we can change later on, so we don't really need to worry about it. Let's get into the meat of things. So, to explain what we're looking at first off, so by the way, some of this information, like the pointers here, you'll only see if you're running in dev mode, so there's a little less information when you're not running in dev mode. That is SIG developer, to be specific. So, the things that we're looking at here, so what we've got is we have, in this item, the root node here, the entity model, is a prefab. You'll see several different types of nodes that can, or different classes that can, entity models can be, as well as different sub-objects. So when we have a prefab, we have this ents array, and so we have two entities here. There's ents0 and ents1. ents1 is typically going to be your kinematic constraint, as it's called here. So the model is nplugDyna s kinematic constraint. This is the thing that determines the movement parameters. So you can see here that we've got like the translation axis, the translation min, translation max, the rotation axis, and the angle min, angle max in degrees. There's also these functions, like translation animation function. We've got two here. You can have up to 4 for both the rotation and the translation. And these determine, they're sort of like a description of one animation that's played, and then when it ends, then the next animation plays, and it just loops infinitely. So we'll go through how we can set these up in a bit, but we don't need to worry about that yet. So this is the thing that decides the actual animations. For just a side note here, there is in this class here the nplugDyna s prefab constraints params. This is a bit advanced, but basically you can change the second lot of 4 bytes as a uint or an unsigned integer, and this determines the index of the dynamic object model that it applies to. When we only have one object that is animated or moving, then that's always going to be 0, so we don't need to worry about it, but for more complex objects you do, otherwise it won't work properly. So the first entity here, we've had a look at the kinematic constraint, but the first entity here, we can see the model is a cplugDyna object model. So this is where the actual meshes are stored. And you'll see there are 3 particular things here that we care about. There's the mesh, which is a cplug solid to model, and then there's the static shape and the dynamic shape. These are both cplug surfaces. The dynamic shape is the important one. The static shape can actually be null. You don't actually need this, but you do need the dynamic shape. If this is null, then it crashes the game. We will be replacing the mesh, the static shape, and the dynamic shape with the respective parts from our swinging hammer over here. So we don't need to worry particularly about what's under here. You can sort of have a look if you want, but that's yeah, not important for this tutorial. We will eventually be looking at these parameters on the entity, the location.quat, which is a quaternion, and location.trans, which is the translation. So this is in the model browser, and this allows us to edit arbitrary parts of this. You can see if I put in 123 here for the translation minimum, we start getting a moving object with translation. One thing you'll notice is when you change the number of functions or things, then you will get random freezes and so on with the animations. I'll explain how to fix that later on, but in essence you need to do a complete reload of the item, which actually involves entering the item editor twice. But we'll get to that in due course. So in order to change this item over here, firstly what we're going to do is we're going to save this as a new item, just to make sure that we have, we're not going to overwrite our template item, so we'll do that to start with. Now, the next thing is that we need to find our source item. So we have hammer template large is what we want. In this source, by the way, you can put an asterisk as a wildcard, and so you can, if something is in a folder, you put an asterisk and then type the item name or some part of the item name, and you should be able to find things fairly easily. So in our case, we want the hammer template large, so we'll select this. Now, keep in mind, this is selecting the source item. So the destination item is the one we're editing, which is currently that. So let's select the hammer template large. Okay, now we are going to choose the elements of the destination item that we're going to replace. In this case, we could choose lots of different things. Like, for example, you can replace the entity model itself with the entity model of another item to sort of wholesale copy the item. So if we were turning a static item into a dynamic item, we would have to copy the entity model from, or various subcomponents from another item. We're not going to do that at the moment. In terms of the entities themselves, it has this element here, but that doesn't work yet. Theoretically, in the future, we might be able to do that, but it's a bit more complex. The model here, we could replace this just with a static model by going this nod indirect. We don't want to do that, but it's useful to know for various sort of more advanced item creation techniques. One thing that's important to note is while like dynamic object models can be like they can exist without a kinematic constraint, and they will not move in that case. So you need both of these things to move. They're siblings in this tree hierarchy, but they don't technically need to be, which goes back to the thing I was talking about earlier. So in this case, we want to keep the dynamic object model, but we want to replace all the children. We could also do this piecemeal. We could replace the mesh with some particular mesh, or the static shape with some particular static shape, and similarly. In this case, we just want to replace all the children and do it all at once. But there is, again, there's a bit more flexibility there for certain things. So if we go all children, so we've selected the all children of the dynamic object model here as the destination. Now we need the source. So this goes back to our hammer template large. Now, when you're picking the source, you will get a filtered list only of things that are potentially compatible. You'll get more or less depending on what you select. But in our case, it's pretty straightforward because we just want to copy everything under the static object model from the hammer here. So we can just hit all children. Cool. Now we've got everything configured, and we'll just hit run replacement. And you can see that we immediately get the hammer. This is, of course, not the final animation that we want. Now, when creating custom items like this, one of the things that you'll probably run into at some point is crashes. This is pretty standard because we're essentially sort of coercing the game into saving things that it normally wouldn't, and there's some unsafe things we do. Unsafe in terms of the game might crash. It is generally safer to copy from one custom item to another custom item than copying from a vanilla item into a custom item. The vanilla items, you will definitely get a crash at some point, but with custom items, it's potentially just okay. So what we're going to do in order to try and avoid any crashes we don't need to have is we're going to basically save the item very frequently. So we'll save it now, just overwrite it, that's okay. I'll now show you how to do a complete refresh. So once we save the item, we go back to the main editor. Cool. We can see our new item here is sort of working. You'll notice the thumbnail isn't updated. We'll fix that as one of the last things just because that can be a little fiddly sometimes. So we'll come back into the item editor here. You'll notice that the hover over this item still shows the bounding box for the balloons. It hasn't changed to the hammer yet. So when we do the item refresh, this will update. So we'll just click edit. This will then refresh the item. This does not necessarily refresh animations. You need to do it again for that. But if we go back, we'll now see that the bounding box has updated. So let's edit some animations. You don't need to save the item for that to happen, by the way. That just happens because we're entering and leaving the item editor. So let's go back to the model browser and change the parameters for the animation. Now, one thing that we'll notice, if I put a pivot position here at 0, you'll notice that our origin for this item is on the swinging, sort of the pivot point here. Now, typically you'd want that, we definitely want that to be the pivot point. However, we also want to be able to place the item in a more convenient way. One thing we could do here is we could say -32 for another, whoops, not -3, for another pivot point, and you can now see that the camera doesn't want to go down too much, but we've got a pivot point right down near the bottom of the thing there. So we're going to use this idea to make it a bit easier to place the item so that it's flush on the floor, but not with the pivot parameter here, or the pivot position. So we'll get rid of these. What we are going to do is on the entities list here, and particularly while you can set like a translation offset for the kinematic constraint, this does nothing. So you don't need to worry about that. However, for the translation component on the main dynamic object model, what we're going to do is set this to 32, which will, I think this will move at 32 up, which will bring the origin of the item, quote unquote, level with the ground. So we can do that. We can actually save this now. I usually append a new number so that you create new items every time. This avoids overriding existing items. Sometimes you might want to do that, but it avoids that, and it means that we have a record of each item that we create as we're going along. And so if you do happen to get a crash, then you can go back to the stage that was immediately before the crash and try something else or figure out why that might have happened. Maybe just repeating the operation will fix it because the crash was due to something else. It's sort of hard to tell in a lot of these situations. So we'll save this as a new item here. Right, we'll come back out. You'll notice that the pivot point is still, or the place where we're sort of holding the item is still the same. So we can do a refresh here. And now you'll notice that the item has updated, and this new position that we put in here, this 32 here, has taken effect. And that's because of the refresh. So we can go back out, and now we can see that the mouse cursor is at the bottom of the item. If we place it in free ground mode, for example, you can see that it is flush with the level, or almost exactly flush with the level of the ground. It looks like there's a slight gap, maybe. So yeah, so you can fine tune that as you see fit. So let's edit the actual positions themselves. So first off, we can always just save a new copy to begin with, and then we'll just save over that. That's fine. What we need to do now is over here in the model browser, we want to come down to the kinematic constraints here, so we can collapse that. And what we're going to do is create a two-stage rotation animation. And this is swinging one way and then swinging back the other way. So we'll say about 45 degrees, sounds about right, for the sort of angle that we want to do. Y is not the correct, like we can see that it's rotating sort of around the y-axis, y being up, so it's rotating around the y-axis. Now we don't want that, we want it to swing back and forward, which means that we're going to need either the z or the x-axis. If we try the z-axis, then you can sort of see that it is roughly doing what we want, except that it's doing it in the wrong way. So we don't want the z-axis, we want the x-axis. And now we can see that it is actually swinging in the way that we want. So we have our parameters here of -45 to 45, but we need to change the style of this and the timing because it looks a bit off. So the first thing we'll do is we'll add a new easing to the chain. This will collapse because the title changes here, but you just need to expand it again. And then we can add and remove those as we choose a minimum of 1, maximum of 4. The easing that we want, linear is not going to look like it's swinging very well. So we're going to choose quad in out. quad refers to the type of curve, which is just a quadratic. In and out refer to whether it eases, on which end it eases. So you can have, for example, like a quad in, which will, you'll see that it starts very slowly and then speeds up. We could also have a quad out where it slows down right at the end, but it starts quite quickly. Quad in out is what we want, and this is going to go up, sort of slow down, and then it'll swing back the other way. Now, it's not swinging back the other way at the moment because we have a quad in out and a quad in out, but they're both going in the same direction. So we want to change the second one to reverse, and then it will start at the end and go back to the start. Now, don't be worried about the animation not updating yet. We need to do a full reload for some of these to update. The timing is a bit off, so let's change this to say 2.5 seconds, and 2.5 seconds, and we can see that it is looking a lot better now. You can see this pause here. This is because we decreased the overall period of the animations, and so it's getting a bit confused. Again, this will be solved when we do a full refresh. This is, now we've got everything sort of as we want it for the animation side. So let's go ahead and save this. We already saved it as a new copy for number 3, so that's okay. We'll leave the editor again. You'll see that the animations are still not fixed. We'll do the full refresh by going in and then coming back out. And now we can see that that is resolved and we have a swinging hammer. Okay, we're not done yet though. We need some other things. So one of them is the icon. That sounds like a good icon. All right, we'll save this as number 4. Save, cool. Go back up. We now have an icon here. We can see all of our new items here. Okay, so let's go back and edit this, and maybe we can polish it up a little bit before we finally finish. Maybe we should bring this down to, say, 31.5, just while we're in the editor. By the way, the translation animation here is active. It's just that we've set the minimum and maximum to be the same. You can also, for example, if we set both of these to be 16, then we would find that it becomes offset somewhat in that direction, as you can see. Now we don't want that. If we set it to -16, then you'll be able to see that it moves back and forward here. You have to manually sort of time all of this together to have it be sort of sync up in the way that you might traditionally want with an item like this, if you were going to do any back and forward motion. Cool. The other things here, you can edit the animations here as well. In this part, we do want to, there was one other thing that we wanted to do, which was to fix the shadows. Under here, under the S instance params, under the dynamic object model, there will be a little box here, cast static shadows. We want to turn that off. Now we can do a save and another refresh. Save, okay. And if we notice, if we place it now, we do not get any shadows. So you won't get any weird stuff from that. We can, if we look down at the ground here, getting pretty close. If we do another refresh, we should find that it moves down slightly, although it's a bit hard to tell. So you can see that the edges of the hammer slightly clip into the ground, I think. In any case, it is pretty close. Yeah, there's a very slightly clip in. So maybe something to consider if that bothers you. Okay, some other things. The meshes that the items use. So moving items only support meshes that have no globally projected textures. What does globally projected mean? So if we take something like this dirt block here, in free block mode, I can scroll up and then scroll in. So you'll notice that as I move this block around, the texture stays the same. And this is so that wherever you put it, it's always going to line up. Like if the texture was fixed to the block, then you could have a free block next to a normal block but offset, say, 16 units in the x-axis, and then the textures wouldn't line up, it wouldn't tile, and it wouldn't look very good. So there's globally projected textures here. The problem with that is that it doesn't work with moving items. Textures that do work, so I'm fairly sure that road platform works. You can see that as I move this around, it does not, like the lines on the tarmac there do not move with it. We get some interesting sort of shadow bugs there. Sausage blocks, obviously the same. I think Dirt Road does have some kind of globally projected stuff, because when I've tried to do this before with the Dirt Road, it hasn't worked. Ice is an interesting one. So if you look at the ice block here, you would maybe think that it doesn't have any globally projected textures, because it, like that red bit in the middle, is stays in the sort of same spot relative to the block. It's not a global thing. However, if so my graphic settings aren't high enough, but in essence you can sort of see that there are markings on the ice here. Now with higher resolution textures, then you will see these as definite scratches. These scratches are globally projected, and so if you have two ice blocks next to each other, then the scratches will always look sort of correct, and that is why ice doesn't work, unfortunately. Custom materials also don't work. Those are, so if we go into, say, create a new item, mesh modeler, the custom textures are all of these ones. So these are typically, you can color them, which is sort of useful. However, these just won't work. I think grass also doesn't work. There's a few others, but just as a plastic doesn't work. But yeah, as an FYI, if your object becomes invisible but still has collisions, then it means that the textures are not supported by moving objects. If you want to use plastic, then I would suggest you use the inflatable matte texture, which is what the balloons use actually. Okay, we can discard that. Yes, so that is some material stuff. Now that we've got our sort of finalized item, by the way, we can bring the inventory back up, grab this swinging hammer 5, and we'll just edit this and change this back to 0, because we have done everything, whoops, not 0, but empty, because we have done everything that we wanted to do. You can change the placement parameters here, so like the grid size, maybe like a grid of, say 8 is good, no horizontal offset, or maybe 4. Vertical size, we'll go 2. Yeah, that sounds pretty good. You can save it again, overwrite, back. Okay, and now you can see that in normal item mode we've got a little bit of a grid, so that it hopefully is a bit easier to, we'll probably have to use free item mode. So I'm not 100% on exactly how to sort of make placement parameters so that everything is sort of as ergonomic as possible, I guess, when placing items. So you'll notice that there's sort of some weird stuff that goes on here to do with sort of connecting items together, except that they don't really connect together like this. So yeah, something to watch out for there. But yeah, otherwise, that's how we create moving items. We can go to the current item and go to the model browser if you're curious. This is similar to the item editor, except that none of the fields are editable because we are not in the item editor. Okay, let's quickly see if we can do the swinging axe blade maybe, and then we'll wrap it up. So yeah, just creating a new copy of the item, swinging blade small. Yes, cool. Alright, save, blah, overwrite. Manipulate meshes, temple, blade, small, select, replace all children, run replacement. You can do more than one thing at once, by the way. Like we can do multiple adjustments at once. However, that does increase the risk of something going wrong. So just something to be aware of in that regard. Unfortunately, you can't copy-paste sort of easings yet. That's theoretically possible, but not something that has been coded in. You can, with these min and max for the angles and translation, you can put the maximum as a negative number and the minimum as a positive number. They don't have to actually be in the right order, and if you do that, then you just get the animation sort of going backwards from what you might expect. So there's no worries there if you want to do that. Take that off. Save this as number 2. Cool. move that to X. Say this is number 3. The icon stuff, I'm a bit paranoid about it. I've had numerous sort of issues. You can see here that we've, like this, it's cut off the bottom of the icon. So this is sort of okay. We'll just save it. Go back here. We'll just do a refresh. Okay, and now when we create the icon, it will have an appropriate icon there. We can probably get rid of that, save, overwrite. Cool. And those are 2 of our items done. You can change layout stuff, you can clone layouts from other things. Cloning layouts from vanilla items will cause a crash eventually, similar to other things, just FYI. We can change the placement parameters here. This is basically the same as what we get through this menu. Yeah, I think that's about it. So we'll save that, quit. There we go. So we have our 2 new items, and then we would just repeat the process for the small swinging hammer as well. This one. Cool. Yep. So that's that. We may as well just save test map. Okay, and there we go. Go back out. And nope. Yeah, that's fine. I'm gonna play offline. It's because I signed in on another computer while I was in the map editor. Edit a track, my maps, test map items. And these, once you save it, by the way, they will be embedded in the map. But otherwise, we're all good. These will be in our items folder, and we can copy paste them to someone on Discord who will be very happy. Okay, that's it for the tutorial. Have a good day.